Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Eric Mansfield. Feel free to call me Dr. Mansfield or call me Eric, whichever makes you feel comfortable. Welcome to EDS 301, Cognition, Development, and Motivation in Academic Settings. Uh, Today we're going to start with a video that's going to focus on the effective teacher. Now, over the course of the semester, we will have a series of videos each week that will accompany the lecture, the PowerPoint, and the readings. We will have three primary units over the course of the semester. We'll have a unit on social emotional learning. We'll have a unit that will focus on the cognitive aspects of learning, and we'll have one that is focused on student motivation. But before we can really get into those three areas, one of the things that's really important is to talk a little bit about what do we mean by an effective teacher, a good teacher. And so this video is going to focus on elements of effective teaching and how our understanding of that model teacher, what things do they bring to the classroom that will influence the social emotional aspects, the cognitive aspects, or the motivational aspects. So by now we've had a chance to do some introductions within the class, as well as you could read a little bit about my background and some of the events that have led me to teaching. And the first thing that I would like to do is to talk about effective teaching is I need for you as students to think a little bit about who's been an effective teacher in your classroom. You've had an opportunity to take a look at the PowerPoint. And one of the first things that I like to do is, many of you have been in school for 12 plus years, and I want you to take a second to think about, if you haven't already, what qualities or attributes do you consider important for that teacher, that effective teacher? What things did they do? What characteristics did they possess that made them such an effective teacher? As you sit there and you think about those characteristics and you write some of those things down, I want you to also think about teachers that you've had over the years that haven't generally been very effective. Perhaps poor instructors, poor teachers. Now, easily we could just, if one of the things on your effective teacher list was they were really organized, it's obviously very easy to say a disorganized teacher. But think hard about what things specifically did some teachers do that made learning difficult in the classroom? Forming relationships with others difficult in the classroom. As this is a video, I've already gone ahead and generated a possible or potential list of attributes of characteristics for both types of teachers. You will notice that in the list that I created for the classroom, sorry, I'm moving over to a PowerPoint that I've created. If you look at the list, you'll see that there's a number of things that effective teachers do. For instance, you see that they are oftentimes very enthusiastic. You might see that they are flexible as a teacher, or caring, approachable, respectful, knowledgeable. What's interesting is the list that I generated, and your list might look similar, is that the concept or the idea of teachers being knowledgeable oftentimes comes down the list. There's a lot of other characteristics or attributes that teachers identify, or I mean students identify as being important before they get to knowledgeable. Well, what does that mean exactly? And what I've learned over the years is, while knowledge is important for teaching, that many students don't see that as a characteristic or attribute that is at the forefront of being effective. That there are many other qualities, many other characteristics that students are looking for in their teacher before having a strong knowledge base. Now, I'm not dismissing knowledge. We're just saying that being that effective teacher does not necessarily translate to just being a highly knowledgeable teacher. When you take a look at things that pop up on the attributes or characteristics that make for a poor teacher, you'll hear students oftentimes comment about that they show favoritism, or perhaps they are boring, they don't provide feedback to you as a student, or that they're lazy, poor communication, disorganized, etc. Now, it's easy to point out flaws in anyone, all right? But when we're focusing as a teacher, I am by no means ever saying that in order to be an effective teacher that you need to possess all those characteristics. No. What we realize is that teachers that are generally pretty good in the classroom, they possess a few of those characteristics. That they are organized, that they are approachable, that they're caring to their students, that they can communicate effectively. You don't need to have every characteristic to be an effective teacher. You have 3, 4, 5 of those characteristics, and generally, you're probably going to be pretty satisfied, and I think your students will respond fairly well to your instruction. Now, the question becomes, if you can identify a list of characteristics, and if I were to ask, say, a first-year teacher or a 10-year veteran the same question, what attributes or characteristics make for an effective teacher, do you think that their list would be much different than yours? Do you think new teachers, more veteran teachers, do you think their lists are more similar or dissimilar to yours? Well, what you find is that, with the exception of some priorities, the list of attributes and characteristics of effective teaching are pretty similar across ages, across experience of teachers. We kind of know what good teaching looks like. Well, if we know what good teaching looks like, then why isn't every teacher an effective teacher? We all know what goes into it. Why doesn't everybody just become this great, effective teacher? And the truth is, it's really hard work. It's really hard work. Teachers get burned out, and they have to find that source of energy that brought them to teaching to get back in the classroom and maintain an effective teaching position. Or things are going on outside of the classroom in their lives personally. Well, sometimes we need to compartmentalize and focus on our students, and that's hard work. Sometimes we don't have the most receptive students, receptive parents, receptive administration, and they're working against us, and we have to work harder. Effective teaching is hard work. And so we keep that in mind because sometimes we hear stories about how we were born to teach, and I've always known I wanted to teach, and that's important. That can be really helpful. But when you get into year 3, 5, 10, 15, what helps you maintain that focus? What helps maintain that passion for teaching that many of us have, especially early on? So, think about where you want to be as a teacher and what will help encourage you to maintain that passion. One of the things I like to do for all students is to share with you a little story of a student that I've had in the past. Forgive me while I put on my glasses. I've asked students over the years to talk about teachers, models that they've had that have been really effective, made an impact on their life, and to talk a little bit about that. And one student, a number of years back, had wrote this, and I'll just read this and I'll ask a question here in a minute. Throughout my entire grade school and high school experience, I had a variety of teachers. I hate to say this, but most of my experiences were not positive ones. I had more bad teachers than good. Some of my bad experiences consisted of being yelled at because I was too quiet, being placed at the table in the back of the classroom by myself because I hummed to myself as I colored. That was in kindergarten. And being completely ignored. I was the invisible child in the classroom, which is not as much fun as it sounds. Then there was my sixth grade teacher that made a difference in my life. She was the teacher that made sure all of her students felt special. Her name was Miss Rexroth at the time, now it is Miss Benzinger. She would single out the children that needed a little extra attention and become their quote-unquote talent scout. Her job was to find something that her students were really good at and then encourage them in that area. She made me believe in myself. When I first entered her classroom, she made me feel like I was just as important as every other student in the room. None of my other teachers had ever done that. For once in my school career, I was not ignored. I had become somebody. I share that with you because it is very easy for us as teachers to forget about a student and what they might be experiencing. What was your first impression as I read that to you? What stood out to you most? One of the things that I'll hear students comment on is how they had an overall sense of sadness as they read that. And I totally understand that. For instance, the student went for 6 years feeling like she was invisible. Now, no student should go 1 year, let alone 6 years, feeling invisible. So I get the sadness part. And then the flip side of that was, well, thank God for Miss Benzinger. Thank God for this teacher that they stepped up and became that talent scout. If she hadn't stepped up, how many years might go by where this student continues to feel invisible? No one wants to feel invisible or no, that they're not of value. And so when you hear that, it makes you think, wow, we really do impact our students. You know, we can become that talent scout, finding what students do really well, encouraging them, and hopefully making them feel less invisible and coming to the forefront of the classroom. Each one of you can become that teacher. Each one of you can find something special within each student that brings that student out of their shell, that maybe makes them feel special, that makes them feel valued. And I share that with you because it's easily forgotten how we make a difference in so many students' lives. Clearly, this teacher made a difference in this student's life, and you can do that too. So let's talk a little bit about this class and the importance of taking what we learn in here and applying it to our overall teaching effectiveness. Now, this class is an educational psychology class, which principally means that psychology studies how people think, why people behave certain ways, and then you just put that into a classroom context, right? So we're going to study how teachers influence how students learn, how students interact with one another, how students develop, and within a classroom context. Now, many times we're accused as educational psychologists of studying things that are pretty common sense, things that people already know, pretty obvious. Well, sometimes the obvious isn't always true. And I give you some examples that in the PowerPoint where we think about grouping children by abilities might actually facilitate learning because we can interact with each group where they're at and speed up the process. And if we identify kids that are slow or struggling students, that by setting students up in groups, it allows us to be able to identify what specific needs they have and get them up to class level or on grade level. Think about it. How many of you were growing up had participated in some sort of group learning where teachers identified you as one of 2 or 3 different groups? Actually, it's quite common, and we know what those groups are. Now, they might have different names or funny names. They might have the Cardinals and the Blue Jays and the Robins, all right? But we all know what the groups are. You have a high-achieving group, an on-level group, and perhaps a below-level group, okay? Everybody knew which group was which. Well, the idea was by meeting the needs of students where they're at, we would actually facilitate learning and help hopefully bring the slower learners or the ones that are struggling, bring them up to on-level learning or on-grade level. Well, what we find out when we do the research is that that's not the case. That the ability grouping, the tracking, is not necessarily a very effective means by meeting the needs of the students. That a more mixed ability group is probably going to have greater benefits. Those benefits include social and cognitive and motivational. And so if we want to focus on bringing the below level learners up to grade level, keeping them by themselves doesn't really do it, okay? And there's other things too. The idea is in this classroom, we're going to talk about things that you might have experienced that you think that are really effective, that when you look at the research, it might not translate to a good classroom practice. If that's the case, are you willing to change? Well, what we find is effective teachers are always looking for things that will improve their classroom instruction, their classroom dynamics, and they're willing to make those changes. So, having said that, in this class, or for the effective teacher, we are going to focus on a number of different characteristics. But in the PowerPoint, you'll see that effective teachers, good teachers, have a lot of characteristics, a lot of attributes, but we're going to focus on 4 principal ones. One is that effective teachers tend to make good decisions. They seem very fluid. It seems as if they're able to focus on multiple groups at a time, and their decision making just seems almost effortless. All right? We're going to talk about teachers that have a strong self-knowledge and self-regulation skills. We're going to talk about teachers that tend to have make use of critical reflection. And lastly is effective teachers are looking to apply educational research. So let's talk about each one specifically. First and foremost, good teachers tend to make good decisions. Well, where do those decision-making skills come from? What we find is good decision-making often stems from experience. The more experiences that you have, the more information that you could draw from, which will lead you to hopefully make better decisions. So then the question becomes, what does that mean for you coming out of college? Are you destined to be a poor teacher, ineffective teacher because you don't have as much experience? Well, there might be some truth there. So we have to ask, what do we do? We're sophomores, we're juniors in college. What do we do so that we make better decisions earlier in our teaching career? I like to think of it like this. If you have a learning curve that is like at this trajectory, okay, what can we do to lower the curve? What can we do to make the learning less difficult? Okay. Well, when it comes to experience, you need to get some experience. How do we do that? Well, if you like to work with kids in a physical educational setting, doing activities, you look to volunteer at the Y. You look to assist kids in coaching, right? If you like to work with younger students in their language, arts, reading, we have programs like America Reads, where you can tutor kids and help them develop their reading skills. Perhaps you do things such as camp counseling. You know, you're a camp counselor during the summertime. Perhaps on Sundays you have a church affiliation and you work with young kids in small groups there. Each one of those examples, while not having necessarily lesson plans and structured setting as a classroom, each one of them gives you an opportunity to interact with young kids, young children, K through 12, where you get a better chance to develop your communication skills, your learning your classroom management skills, or how to manage a group. All right, those are all valuable things to a incoming teacher or new teacher. You can also talk to your professors, ask questions. That's what we're here for. Ask questions about things that you've read, things that you've seen, things that you've experienced. What would you do in this situation? Or what should a teacher do if? Perhaps you have an opportunity to work in an after-school setting, tutoring children, maybe in music. All right, the opportunity to actually work with content of your interest, area of your interest, and help students learn from that. Looking at case studies, reading, these are all opportunities that will help better prepare you those first days of teaching. Now, they're not necessarily the same as a classroom lesson, but each one is providing them insight to how students learn and how you can develop your teaching skills. And the more we have before we get in the classroom, the better. Now, a second component of effective teaching requires teachers or looks for teachers that have a strong self-knowledge or self-regulatory skills. What does that mean? Well, self-knowledge is the ability to understand one's strengths and weaknesses. Now, each teacher has things that they do well and things that perhaps they don't do as well, especially early on. Effective teachers know what they do well and are able to work from a position of strength all along developing their areas of weakness. Let me give you an example. Say, for instance, that you are going to be a history teacher, okay, or a social studies teacher, and you're working in a social studies with a social studies subject matter. And as a teacher, you say, "Oh, I'm really good at working with small groups, one-on-one. I love doing that. You know, more hands-on." I'm like, "Well, that's great. I love that." How often do you get a chance to teach a social studies curriculum strictly on a one-on-one or small group setting? You just don't. You have to develop your whole class instruction skills. You need to be able to work with the classroom, an intact classroom, a big classroom, and maintain students' attention, manage the classroom, and yet at the same time teach content. All right. The idea is that I'm really good at working with small groups, but you may not always have an opportunity to work with small groups. So find out what it is that you do well and utilize those skills all along developing or working on what you don't do so well. Now, self-regulation, what does that mean? Self-regulation is focusing on a learner's self-regulation for myself, for students, for teachers. It's their ability to identify goals or objectives and to be able to figure out how do they achieve them. Good teachers are able to create a set of objectives, create some goals, and figure out how do I help my students achieve that. For example, let's say that I was a physical trainer and you came to me and you were looking to get in shape. and you say, hey Eric, I'm looking to shed a few pounds. I want to get in better shape. What can I do? Well, it's $50 a month, and to work with me. And you're like, well, that's reasonable. So you write a check out, and you give me a check for $50. And right at that time, I pass you a piece of paper, and on the piece of paper it says, eat well and exercise often. Now, as a teacher, as a person who's looking to get into shape, you'd probably look at me crazy and say, give me my money back, right? That eating well and I already know that, Eric, right? What you want is more specific detail. You want information that's going to help you achieve that end goal of being better shape, lose a few pounds. Good teachers are able to set a series of objectives, goals, and then figure out how do they help the students achieve those along the way. Now, in addition to self-regulation, strong self-regulation skills, good teachers also are able to utilize critical reflection. What does that mean? That means that good teachers are able to identify not only what they do wrong in a lesson, but also what things do they do well. As a teacher, it's very easy for us to focus on the things where we make mistakes in our lessons, things that we would like to improve and going forward. But you also have to take a look at what are the things that are going well in the classroom. Once you understand the things that you do well, you can incorporate those into future lessons. It's easy to focus on the negative things, fix those things, but you also have to incorporate the things that you do well. Good teachers are oftentimes utilizing critical reflection. Lastly, effective teaching requires that teachers are willing to change, that they're not going to become stagnant, that they're always going to look to grow as a teacher. That means they're looking to apply educational research. Where does that come from? Well, that comes from our reading, that comes from our perhaps classes that we take beyond our bachelor's degree. Perhaps it comes in the form of workshops or in services. A lot of times, teachers that are looking to grow as a professional, they approach each in-service, each workshop, not as something that they've heard before or something that they've learned about once before. They look at each opportunity as something new. And so good teachers, effective teachers, are looking to continually grow as a professional. More classwork, continue up on the different methodologies or pedagogical practices to teach their content. We're always looking to grow. Now, as an effective teacher, you'll notice that the path is oftentimes one that requires a lot of hard work and time. And I put in the PowerPoint a series of steps or phases that many students and eventual teachers will go through when they eventually become, hopefully, that master teacher. Sometimes teachers decide to leave the profession because after a number of years they become dissatisfied. And that dissatisfaction often comes from a misunderstanding of the role or the time required for teachers to become that expert teacher. It doesn't happen overnight. We think that we go to school for 3-4 years, we graduate, we do our student teaching, all of that stuff, and we're just going to step in the classroom and suddenly become a really great, effective teacher. And it just doesn't work like that. It requires lots of time. And that time, if you go into the profession thinking that it'll happen really quickly, and you get some difficult classes, it's easily understood why some teachers might become dissatisfied. So if you know, by looking at the chart that I provided you, if you take a look at the time that is required for students to eventually become that expert teacher, it will help you understand that what's essential in becoming or staying. What's a good word for it? Passionate, or perhaps working toward that end goal. All right. So one of the things that I put a case study in the PowerPoint that's entitled "Going Through the Motions," and what that case study reveals is that a lot of times, if you if you read the case study, it says, we have great students here, the principal of Bayside High School boasts. They're bright, they're motivated, most of our graduates go on to college. Who could ask for anything more? Certainly the students at Bayside High School have the school routine down pat. They come to school every day, they take notes on their assignments, they study for their tests. But when you ask the students what they're learning, they have a hard time pinning it down. One student tells you science, history, math, things like that. Another one answers, information I'll probably need in college. And a third responds, lots of stuff. What will they use this stuff for, you ask? They look at you blankly. One finally says, we're not supposed to use it for anything. This is just school. We'll worry about real things once we graduate. Okay. Now, in any case study, one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, does that sound authentic? Could that be a student in today's high school classroom? Yeah, I think it could be. Go to class, take notes, get ready for tests, come back the next day, do it again, same thing, same thing. Yeah, that sounds very reasonable. So then the question becomes, why do the students at Bayside view their school learning as something separate from the rest of their lives? Well, what we find is that teachers have to do more to relate the material to the student's life if you expect them to be able to connect the information to things outside of the classroom. How many times have you asked yourself or asked a teacher, why are we learning this? Why do we need to know this? Now, I personally find those to be valid questions. If you were to ask a teacher, where will we use this, or how do we use this? Sometimes teachers think that it's students' just way of kind of dismissing the material, or perhaps it's just their way of trying to avoid learning the material. Sometimes it's just a valid question, like, hey, when are we going to ever use this stuff? Why do I need to know this stuff? Okay, how do I incorporate this stuff into my life? And if as a teacher you can't think about ahead of time the importance of why you're teaching the stuff you're teaching, well, that's on you, not the students. So it is a valid question. So what do we need to do as a teacher to help our students see the importance of what it is that we're doing, and perhaps help them understand where they will use this information in the future? So the question becomes, what do we as teachers do? What is our job? What do effective teachers routinely do that sets them apart from perhaps other teachers? Well, one of the things is, and I have a slide in the PowerPoint that talks about placing teaching within a larger context. What does teaching look like beyond just teaching content? And I talk about 4 separate things that teachers routinely do. One is the specific things that teachers ask students to do, give messages about academic work and school in general. What does that mean? That means that as teachers, the things that we ask our students to do that we make our students do in a classroom, it sends a message about what school's all about. How often have you been in a classroom where you've had a teacher give you a worksheet, and then as soon as you're done with that worksheet, they give you another one, right? Or you learn all day, and at the end of the day, the teacher says to you, after you've read the chapter, I want you to answer the questions at the end of the chapter, and get ready for a quiz on Friday. Well, if you had a lot of school experiences where you're doing worksheets, you're doing problems from the back of the book, you're reading the chapter, answering the questions, get ready for the... After a while, many students start to see learning as very tedious, as learning as something that is something to get done and not something to enjoy. I always laugh. Think about how many times you're getting ready to buy something. Maybe it's a computer, maybe it's a software program, maybe it's a car, maybe it's maybe any sort of big item that you're going to purchase. Before you purchase those things, what do? Many of us do what? We go online and start looking at reviews. Reviews of those items, reviews of those computers, that TV, of that stereo, of that car, of that whatever it is. We look at this stuff. We might even spend hours looking at stuff related to what we want to buy. Well, you're learning. And time just flew by. Time can fly by really easily when you're engaged in what you're learning. But in the classroom, sometimes students feel like they're just going through the motions, that learning is tedious. Well, if you can't connect the content of what you're learning to the student's life, or to things that they watch, or to things that they've seen or listened to, the students have a hard time of seeing the importance of what they're doing. That's your job as a teacher, to make those connections. A second point I talk about is that schools and teachers have a major impact on students' development over the long run. What does that mean? Well, I will concede that teachers impact cognitive development, what we learn, right? Stuff. Students learn a lot of stuff. But we also realize that we impact students in a lot of other ways. We impact their attitudes. We impact their beliefs. We impact their morals. We impact the students' interpersonal relationships with other classmates. We have an impact on student development well beyond just cognition stuff, right? And so the question is, as a teacher, okay, what am I doing in my classroom to broaden students' development beyond just stuff? I always think about those great coaches that we've had, or those great teachers that we've had, or an older sibling, or one of our parents perhaps. What did they do that made us perhaps feel good about ourselves? I had, for instance, growing up, my mom was always was my key supporter. She always made me feel like I could, okay, that I was capable, that I could become confident in the things that I'm doing. Now, what we're talking about is help developing student self-efficacy. How do I help my students believe that they can accomplish whatever it is that we're doing in the classroom? What are we doing? Now, a lot of times when you think about teaching, a lot of people just overcomplicate it. We have content and stuff that we learn and stuff that we're experts at, and we're going to teach our students that stuff. But what are we doing to help build our students' self-efficacy? How do we make our students feel successful in the classroom? What are we doing? Good teachers, effective teachers, they do those things. They become that quote unquote talent scout and find out what students do well and how do we build them up, become more confident in their abilities as a learner. The third thing is that teachers are more effective when they coordinate their efforts with one another. What does that mean? What that means is that good teachers are able to communicate effectively with other teachers and find out what are they doing in their classroom that's working. Okay? It's not about simply stealing lesson plans from another teacher. Okay? What it's about is finding out about our students and the kinds of things that work in other teachers' classroom and incorporating them into our own lessons. It's about talking with what the teachers did the previous year in math or in English or in a science class, find out what they did so that we know where they left off. So when the kids come back from summertime and they say, we don't remember any of this stuff, as a teacher we step in and say, oh, it'll come back. You know, sometimes I'm a little bit foggy too after a lot of time off, right? Students just need some time, need some becoming familiar with the material again. And if you talk to the teachers from the previous year, you find out, here's what we did, and here's where they left off, and here's what I can do to incorporate that information. But effective teachers are always communicating with other teachers about strategies that they use, things that work well with certain students and perhaps not so well with other students, and finding about how do we incorporate this content from my class into the content of your classroom. Okay? For instance, good teachers are able to, if you're in a, say for instance, you're in a math class and you're learning certain skills, maybe in your science class you're able to incorporate some of those things. Or for instance, you're learning in a science class about natural disasters, or you're learning about certain things such as earthquakes or tsunamis. Well, that's the stuff that you're learning in science and how they take place. That's a good way to incorporate that into some of our literature or to our English. The idea is teachers are talking with one another, incorporating that material so that students are getting more and more exposure to the content. Lastly, school is only one institution of many in a student's life. And it's important that we find out those other institutions. Okay? What are those other institutions? They may be, the student's family. It might be the student's extracurricular activities such as soccer or football or basketball or softball or volleyball or dance or any number of things. Perhaps they're involved in musical theater. Perhaps they're involved in understanding the kinds of things that they watch or the music that they're listening to, or maybe as they're older they have jobs, or perhaps they have their peer relations, the friends that they hang around with. The idea is, as teachers, the more information we know about our students and the things that they're involved with, the greater opportunities that we have to connect with them, to connect content with their life. If we want learning to be meaningful, we have to understand what's meaningful in a student's life. Sometimes teachers forget about what's going on in a student's life, and we just expect them to come to class, we teach our stuff, and they just get it. Well, the truth is, the more that we know about our students, the more opportunities we have to connect with them personally, but also to connect the content with them. That's what effective teachers routinely are able to do. Now, in addition to the types of things that we do from a pedagogical standpoint, the methodology of teaching, one of the things that we've realized that is really important for effective teaching is to understand what things guide our practices. You take a look in the book, as well as in the PowerPoint. And in this class, over the course of this semester, we'll talk about things like principles of learning or different theories that guide our practices. And you guys have it in other classes as well. Theories, principles, and a lot of times students just kind of roll their eyes like, oh my goodness, theories. Like, what is a theory? And we suddenly start becoming overwhelmed with theory. Like, that doesn't seem like it's going to affect us as a teacher. Well, it really does. Let me give you an example. Okay. Well, first of all, what is a theory? All right. Theory is an explanation as to why. Why are the students doing this? Okay. Principles are an explanation of what. This is what I see routinely. This is what I see again and again and again. And theories help explain why. For instance, one of the things that I've observed for years is students that take notes in class tend to do better than students who don't, right? Why? Well, information processing theory explains that. Students, when they're writing notes, they are looking at what they're writing, so they're seeing, they're writing, they're listening, they're doing three things. They're processing information in more than one way. If you're just sitting there, perhaps all you're doing is taking the information in auditorily. Well, you're more likely to remember information when you process it in more than one way, and taking notes does that. Another thing that I've noticed is that students in a classroom, if they are perhaps misbehaving in a classroom, or for that matter, if they're doing something really positive, and a teacher recognizes them and either punishes them or praises them, suddenly other students in the classroom start doing the same thing if they're getting praise, or perhaps stop doing something because they see a classmate being punished. For instance, you're chewing gum in class, you're not supposed to do that, and a teacher catches you and says something to you. Suddenly all the other students who are doing that stop doing that, okay? Or if you see a student is doing something and the teacher offers a lot of praise, suddenly all the other students start doing something similar. Why? Well, social cognitive theory explains why. Students look to be reinforced, okay, or to avoid punishment. We learn through observation. So if you observe someone being punished for something, you stop doing that to avoid being punished. If you see someone doing something and they receive praise and you want that praise, you start doing that something, okay? That's what social cognitive theory explains. Now, why do I bring that up in the classroom? Well, because one of the things that's really important for effective teaching is, what did we say? Good decision making. Good decision making is based on things that we've observed and hopefully understanding or explanations as to why students behave a certain way, why students learn more effectively a certain way. Well, we use theory to guide us in our practices. When students are struggling, we ask the question, why? Theory provides an answer, which then helps us provide a solution. So we utilize theories or principles to help guide our practices. Effective teachers utilize theories to their benefit. The last thing that's important to understand that effective teachers are able to do routinely is they're able to read, they're able to learn from, be it from newspaper articles or from even from videos that they've seen of classroom practices or headlines that are posted on Yahoo or on Google or whatever it might be. They see things that are educational related, and they're able to take a look at that information and figure out, is this information useful to my practices? Now, what does that mean? That means that effective teachers are able to understand the different types of information, perhaps research, that is going to be beneficial to their effectiveness as a teacher. And what we realize is that some stuff is more beneficial than other. And in the book, and you probably had this in other classes, you'll see 3 different types of research that are often used in social science or in education. Those 3 types of research are descriptive research or descriptive studies, correlational studies, and experimental studies. Now, descriptive research does just that. It describes. It describes what someone sees in their classroom or what they've observed in a study. And generally, descriptive studies are pretty basic. Like, this percentage of boys go into this field. The average scores on the SATs after taking this program was this, or after this reading curriculum or this tutorial program that the students utilize, their scores on the ITBS or the ISATs went up this percentage. What you find is the information is pretty general. It describes, it's descriptive. It uses things like mean, median, mode, okay? I like to refer to that information as light bulb research. What does that mean? A light bulb goes off the top of your head, right? Bing. Do I change everything I do about teaching based on a descriptive study? Probably not, okay? Does it offer some suggestions or ideas or things that I might do? Yeah, it does. Light bulb goes off. But if you look at the study and you realize the study was done in Macomb or in a small town like Kelowna or some town around a small town, rural town, do you think that those demographics are going to be the same demographics as Moline or Peoria or Chicago? Perhaps not. Will those students have the same lived experiences as the kids in the small rural town? Probably not. Should I assume then that based on what I read that concept or whatever I was doing in the study should just translate to all kids in all different backgrounds? Probably not. Might there be something there? Yeah, it's a light bulb. It's a great idea. It's something that makes me think, like, I wonder if I could use that in my classroom. Descriptive studies can be really good starting points. The next type of research that you'll see a lot in education is correlational research. And correlational research helps people understand the relation between 2 or more variables. How does one variable perhaps influence or impact another variable? You've seen things like positive correlations or negative correlations, okay? Now, correlational research is helpful in one aspect. If the correlation is well developed, meaning that we've done lots of studies and we've seen a really strong correlation amongst 2 or more variables, that over time, a pattern starts to emerge and we can start to form predictions based on those correlations. Now, unfortunately, they are just correlations, and correlational is not causation. Correlation is not causation, meaning that just because I saw these things happen together a lot doesn't mean that one thing caused the other. For instance, I incorporate a reading program in my school, and I've observed that students over time their reading scores have started to really improve. So I instantly say, oh my goodness, this program is proof that it helps lead to kids being better readers. Well, it might have a strong impact, but in the note that I sent home about reading programs and helping develop better reading skills, maybe a bunch of parents took it upon themselves to spend more time reading with their kids, and now suddenly their reading improves because they're getting more reading at home also. So correlation is really helpful because it can establish relationships, and we can start to form some predictions based on those correlations, but we can't necessarily draw causation. Okay? They use a lot of correlational research in education because it's hard to control a classroom environment. And so we like to look at things in their natural setting, and correlational research is a good tool for that. But you'll see things like positive correlations where students that spend more time on their homework tend to do better on tests. Students that practice the piano more often will have a better performance. Those are positive correlations. As one variable goes up, the other goes up. Now, on the flip side of that is negative correlation. For instance, spend more time on playing video games, perhaps your test scores start to go down. More time on video games goes up, test scores go down because of more time on that. Okay. Another example might be the more you practice the piano, the fewer mistakes you make. More time on an instrument, fewer mistakes go down, right? That's a negative correlation. No correlation just means that there's no relationship between the variables. Now, as a teacher, that information is a heck of a lot more useful to me because of the established patterns than the descriptive studies. But I still need to be careful about drawing any sort of causation strictly from correlational research. The last type of research is what we refer to as experimental research. Experimental research is where the researcher will manipulate some variable to determine its impact on another variable. You've heard those terms, perhaps a dependent variable and the independent variable, right? And the idea is teachers will utilize experimental research sometimes in a classroom because we have greater control. And in fact, you'll notice that a lot of the boards of higher education are looking for teachers to use much more experimental research in their decision making. They call that data-driven decision making. The idea is, I don't want you to say that the reason why you teach this class this way is because that's how you learned it. No. What we want to hear from teachers is, I decide to teach it this way because the data from studies suggests that this is a more effective strategy, or that I'm going to give my students no more than 30 minutes of homework a night because we find from the research, I'm making this up so don't hold me to this, but we find from the research is more than an hour's worth of homework for any given night that students' motivation, students' attitudes towards school start to rapidly decline, and it starts to have a counterintuitive effect, right? Or we find that students who study for an hour, no more than an hour, that their scores, it doesn't matter if they score 2 hours or if they study 2 hours or if they study 1 hour, it doesn't impact their performances in the classroom any different. So why give kids 2 hours of homework if it doesn't do more for them than 1 hour? All right, if you find that in a study, an experimental study, that's a justification for why you do what you're doing. And a lot of boards of higher education are looking for teachers and for schools and for administrators to make decisions that are more data-driven. That means that they are more certainty in the outcomes of the studies or the experiments. And that's why you'll see more emphasis placed on experimental research than correlational research. So descriptive, correlational, and experimental research each offers teachers different things, and some information is just more useful than other. And descriptive is good, correlational is better, and experimental research is probably, if done well, even better than correlational. But it's really difficult to do experimental research with children or with adolescents because we can't control them. It's not like rats in a lab study where you can control the genetic makeup of the rat or the exact amount of the medicine. Classrooms are more messy. They're not like labs. So anyway, having said that, these are the general things that we look for in the educational experience for teachers that will help lead to a more effective teacher. All right. So our next video is going to focus on other information related to effectiveness in the classroom, and that's an understanding of how it is that students learn and the kinds of things that will impact them in the classroom.